Hi, this is Mike, and once again we're working on the obsolete and the unloved. This is an Ingersoll Rand Spot Air 3R-36 air compressor. It makes 3060 FM at 80 psi. I'm such a sucker for anything that's a radial engine, so first thing I did was try to start it, and like an idiot, I attached a 1/2-inch drill to here, which is part of the starting mechanism, and it drives through those gears inside. I don't know if you can see it, there's a small bevel gear down there, and it promptly broke the gears. So, excuse me while I walk across the shop. I have a donor. It's not in very good shape. It's had water in it. The cylinders are full of rust. The rings are stuck. But anyhow, I've got some spare parts. So I tore it all apart and replaced the driven gear. You can see it's kind of chewed up. And the drive gear, which is really chewed up. Well, when I was changing these, I found that in the past this boss had been broken out. This is what supports the drive gear, and they did a great job of repairing it. I don't know how they welded it. They must have done this 50 years ago. Who knows? But it's not perfect, and you can see where they had to file it down right in here to get it to fit. Well, I didn't have to file the new one near that much to get it to fit. But these are kind of an oddball. It's 3 1/8-inch bore, 2 7/8 stroke on the power cylinders, and then the compressor cylinders are 3-inch bore. Power cylinders have hollow wrist pins in them. The compressor cylinders have solid wrist pins in them. Don't ask me why. There you can see the driven gear. Now, to time this engine, somebody on the Smokestack forum was kind enough to send me a manual to show me how to set up all these camshafts. So the way it's done is, let me turn it the right direction here. Of course I'm not. And I've got rods tangled up. Okay, this is the master rod. In other words, all of the other rods are linked to that one. And this is the number 1 cylinder, number 2, number 3. So you put it on top dead center on number 1. I couldn't find any marks to indicate top dead center, but you line up the number 1 camshaft facing away from the gear. The number 2 camshaft goes away from the gear. Oh, excuse me. No, it goes towards the number 1 cylinder, towards the number 1 cylinder. And if you look very closely, you can see a white mark on a tooth right there. That tooth is tapered. So when you turn it, that one should line up with that gear. And I got rods giving me trouble again. That one should line up. And when number 3 comes around, it should line up. And then this mark here is for the magneto. And it's got a plate that you can remove to look down to line up the timing marks from the top cover. So my cylinders that I plan on using are good and round with no ridge in them. I guess I could point the camera at them, but I don't know if you can see, but they got considerable scratches in them, so it'll probably smoke. I really don't care. All I want to do is run that steam engine with it. A friend of mine gave me that steam engine, and I've had it hooked up to my shop air compressor, and it does run, and it's reversible. Other than that, I don't know anything about it. The cylinder heads, generally you find these with these flanges broken off. These flanges here. And between my existing engine and my parts engine, I had enough cylinder heads to get good flanges. They've got really oddball seats in them. There's a hard seat in the exhaust. The intake is not hardened, but the seats are very narrow. I don't think I've ever seen seats that narrow. But I'm not going to do anything with it. This engine ran for who knows how long. We're just going to lap those. And when you work on these heads, make sure you clean out these holes here. This runs oil into the exhaust valve guide. And without that, things are going to get ugly. More later, as my battery's almost dead, as usual. The reason I had to tear this engine down, in addition to me breaking the starting gears, is it just didn't have enough compression to go. When I tested the compression, number 1 cylinder here had 90 pounds, number 2 had 20, number 3 I had 40. When I tore it apart, the number 1 cylinder was full of mud, and there was no rust in the cylinders, but the rings had all corroded and were all stuck. And hopefully with a new set of rings from Ring Spacers, and we'll be ready to go. Now when I have finished lapping all the valves, and the way I check my work is I spray a little bit of soapy water on the valves and get my air hose and shove it in the hole. See, that one's leaking. I'm gonna have to lap it some more. Another tip, if you think you're gonna bounce the keepers out of there with a socket and a hammer, don't do it. The exhaust, I believe this is exhaust, yes. On the exhaust side, the retainer is very thin, and when you bounce it, it breaks the edge off of it. But fortunately, I had some more. Here is my utterly ridiculous spring compressor. I was able to do one head with my thumbs, but after wrestling with it, I decided this was a better idea. Well, after a half hour of lapping, I was able to get the little rust pit out of the intake valve seat and got it to seal up. I don't video that stuff because you don't want to watch me fiddle around and cuss. So we're going to start in on the pistons. And you can see that they've had plenty of water in them. This is out of the parts engine, this piston here. But you can see that the rings are pretty famously stuck. I've tried soaking them in all kinds of stuff and heating them to see if they'll pop loose, without success so far. So into the vise they go, and I'll start beating and prying and cussing them. Well, it's a cold and frosty day here today. I've got the pellet stove going, fans running, ceiling fan going, and I've been cleaning parts and priming. There's the push rod tubes, the lifting bracket. The cylinders have been honed and scrubbed and washed out. Cylinder heads are rebuilt. All these parts are primed. I scrubbed these cylinders out with soap and water. And originally these engines have a chrome top ring, second ring and oil ring are cast. I went with cast all the way around because the cylinders are not in the best of shape. Looks like somebody fed it a handful of dirt. The rings have arrived. I've got the pistons installed. One cylinder put on. The rings come from Dave Reed at ringspacers.com. I've gotten rings from him before, and there's a trick to fitting these pistons. And what we do is we heat them up with a torch. Let me get set up and we'll look at this again. Well, let's see if I can show you my trick for putting in wrist pins. I put a drop of water on top of the piston. Now the piston's just sitting here. Vise is nothing but something to hold the piston with, or set the piston on the vise for a holder. So I just heat it up until the water starts to boil. You're supposed to use an oil bath and heat them at 250 degrees. I don't have an oil bath. And I've been doing it this way for a whole lot of decades. Never had any trouble with it. Now you can see the water starting to boil. So we know it's at least 212 degrees. So if you got your leather glove, and your wrist pin slides right in. Nothing to it. Now the reason I went with cast rings is they generally seal better in nasty bores. Now the ring gap is supposed to be 10 to 20 thousandths, and I ended up with about 18. There's no taper in these cylinders, but they've eaten a lot of dirt. Now I taped off the cylinders and ran them through the blast cabinet to get all the rust and paint and old dried grease off of them. And then washed the bores after I honed the daylights out of them. I used my dingleberry hone because I broke my rigid hone. And for this thing it probably won't make any difference. Now these bolts are wet. Where they go into the case, they go right into the oil. They had copper washers on here to seal them up. I used a bit of liquid Teflon. This kind of stuff. I've used it for years and it's never failed to seal a bolt yet. And the way I tighten them up is, you old guys will recognize this tool. This is an old distributor wrench, and it's actually made by KD. It's probably as old as I am, but it works great for doing these, and also on the cylinder base bolts on my radial engines. We'll walk over and look at one. And you can't see any of the cylinder bolts. But before all of this stuff is on, you can get in there with this to tighten the cylinder base bolts. It'll also be pretty handy on some of the head nuts. So we're going to continue putting the other cylinders on, put the heads on. The plan is to get this thing to run. And if you notice, somebody has welded the stands to the base plate right here. So I'm going to have to cut those off, weld new stuff on. but I want to get the flywheel off and bead blast it and get the crankcases all cleaned up. And more as it occurs. It's another day and we have a running engine. I didn't videotape it because nobody really wants to see me put cylinders on upside down and clean nuts and bolts and screw things together. Anybody can do that. But what I did learn is these cylinders have a top and bottom. If you can see here, these two nuts on the top are parallel to the ground. If you have one with the stud sticking out the top center, it won't fit. Our next plan of attack is the spider intake for the compressor has some pretty serious dents in it. And I bought some 1-inch steel balls that just fit in these tubes. I thought about trying to push them through there with a grease gun, but I'm afraid I'd get them stuck and then I'd never get them out. So I'm going to try to weld a rod on there and work it down through the tube, and hopefully I can get the dent out with a little bit of heat and a hammer and maybe a couple of hammers, maybe a really big hammer. And as you can see, I've cleaned off my workbench because it's too embarrassing to show it to anybody. It looked like a junkyard exploded up here. Not like my workbench is anything special, but it holds a lot of stuff. We had an issue with the seal in the starter drive. It leaked all over the place. So I've ordered some seals. Had a difficult time getting it apart, but I managed. More as it occurs. Well, no comments about my welding job, please, but it actually worked really good. As you remember, there was a huge dent here. So I bought some 1-inch balls, put some grease, welded it together and put some grease on it, slid it down in through here, and then worked on it with the body hammer. And it turns out really good. I don't know that anybody will ever see it. Now there was another dent up here that I didn't get out completely. You'll notice the bend in the rod, so I can get around the corner. I'm sending multiple balls down through it and stacking them, but there wasn't a lot of success. They just rolled out the other end, but I'm happy with the results. More as it continues. Okay, now you can see the finished results of dent removal in the air compressor inlet pipes. They're still visible, probably more visible with the camera, but it's far better than being smashed flat like it was. If I was really excited about this, I could lead them in and file it down, but I'm not going to be that anal about it. Besides, it's 68 years old. More as it occurs. We're back at it again today. We're fabricating. One of the weakest links on these engines or compressors is they get tipped over and it breaks the exhaust flanges off, and then you end up with stuff like this. There's a spare that doesn't look too bad. So I got the bright idea that one of these compressor inlet tubes, or excuse me, engine air inlet tubes would make a fine pattern. The only trouble is It's got a bigger bolt spacing. After I spent an hour making a perfect cover that doesn't fit. You can see the bolt holes are way off. So once you get one pattern made, the rest is pretty easy. And the plan is to put studs in here, have them on order. I have new hoses on order. You can't find them in this town. You can't even find 1/4-20 double-ended studs. You can get them in metric, but you can't get them in SAE. And the plan is to tap these out to 3/4, which is that's what size that is. And you got enough room to get to the nuts. And I'll tap them, and I'll put a 3/4 street L in there, black iron, and thread it in there as far as reasonable, and then grind the back side of it off. So I've got some mufflers coming. They're lawnmower mufflers, and they will attach to that elbow and point out this way. Now they're pretty large and pretty long, so I'm going to have to make a support from every one of these to support the muffler to keep it from breaking these ears off. I got the carburetor overhauled, and somewhere I have the part number of the kit. What did I do with it? Here it is. Here's the kit number that came from mikescarb.com, and I believe it's for an Onan. It's a very complete kit. Even comes with throttle shaft bushings, idle screw, idle mixture screw and spring, needle and seat. And it's also got a Viton tip on it, which I assume is probably good for gasoline with alcohol in it. The only problem I had was, have you ever had trouble getting out a needle and seat? I know they make a special socket for these, and I have one somewhere, but I can't find it. So what I've done in the past and had to do this time is pound a Torx bit in there and unscrew it. And you can see how corroded it is. So everything's spent a long time sitting in a pot of white vinegar to get the corrosion out. We've got new rivets for our data plate right here. I was able to find kits for both of the sediment bowls at Tractor Supply. I don't know which one is the correct one, because we've got a big one and a little one. So that covers that problem. Still waiting for the seal for the starter drive, and the plan is to get this thing running again, run it for a couple hours complete, make sure I've got all the oil leaks taken care of, and then I'm going to have to saw these stanchions off to get this thing up, get the flywheel and the fan off of it, and get it bead blasted. Supposedly there's timing marks on it, but there's so much rust in there I can't find it. And this bottom plate is all bent up. It's probably been dropped 100 times. So we'll straighten that up. Is that a big crack there? Yes, it is. And I'll just weld another plate on these stanchions and then bolt them down. So the magneto is dated 1 of 57. And the carburetor is 6 of 55. And of course, now I can't find the date. I think it's here on the end. The next issue was spark plug wires. With a magneto, you should run nothing but solid copper wire, and the ends should be soldered on. And in my generation, you could just go to the Napa store and buy Packard 440 wire. Well, if you walk into the Napa store now, and unless it's Japanese or made last year, you can't get any parts for it. So I've got two of those made. I reused the ends and soldered them on. And before we give this thing its final cleaning, before it gets painted, I'll take the carburetor back off, take the magneto off. I want to scrub the magneto down. And I'm not a fan of painting carburetors or magnetos, but you can see when this was built, everything was painted. So that's all we're going to do for today. More as it occurs.